Well, one big problem is the money in the country. The International Monetary Fund could well be bailing us out at some point. There are economists who think that could happen because of the dire state of the economy. In the next few months, Rachel Reeves is going to be giving a budget. Will she be contradicting herself from last year? I think she will. And what kind of respect can we possibly have from her if she says one thing and does another? Let's talk all this through with Liam Halligan, who's an economist and author of the Substack When the Facts Change, which is, of course, a reference to When the Facts Change, I Changed My Mind, which Keynes allegedly said, but we think he might have been misquoted. Liam, great to have you on the programme. Are we heading towards an IMF bailout?
Well, good on you, Peter, for knowing that it might have been a misquote from Keynes when the facts change. You're a learned man. So look, back in 1976, I remember it well. I was a kid. The UK had to go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout because the government at the time, under Jim Callaghan and Chancellor Dennis Healey, had spent too much. The public finances were in a mess. The balance of payments, the sort of external account, was in a mess. And Britain basically was insolvent. And I'm not here to be alarmist, and it doesn't give me any pleasure to say, but I follow financial markets very closely. I'm a former fund manager myself, as well as being a writer and broadcaster. And look, this is absolutely everyday speak in the markets, right? And yet the political and financial class, the political and media class, will not engage with what's actually happening.
Why won't they engage, do you think?
Because a lot of them are economically illiterate, Peter. A lot of them are economically illiterate, and they almost take pride in their economic illiteracy. I've spent a lifetime at the top of the British media. You know, I can't get this stuff on mainstream television, so that I'm using my Substack, because I feel a heavy responsibility here as one of the few properly financially and economically literate people in the British media, if you like, with a platform, albeit increasingly these days my own platform. And I have to convey what is actually going on. When the 30-year gilt yield, which is the cost of government borrowing over 30 years, the annual interest payment, is 5.5, 5.6, 5.7, when it was 4.8 for a moment at the height of the Liz Truss mini budget crisis. And yet people are still, pretending, that Liz Truss crashed the economy, and it's just infantile. Mm-hmm. It's infantile to ignore what's happening.
What would it mean practically? We've had Stuart.
We'll come on to that. So, I had to get somebody serious on the record to say this. Mm-hmm. And so, it took a lot of courage from Professor Jajit Chadha, who ran the National Institute for Economic and Social Research for almost a decade, the premier macroeconomic think tank. It is to respectable economic analysis what the IFS is to tax and spend policy.
Sure.
And Jajit Chadha, gave me this interview, and he's not an alarmist guy. He's not a Tory. He's not some kind of anti-Labour person. On the contrary, he's a very moderate person, which is why his warning is so incredible. And he says, look, we are heading for the same thing that happened in 1976 unless we change course, because the government, the Tories, left Labour with an awful inheritance. Labour have since been massively ramping up borrowing and spending. And we're going to drive the economy over a cliff.
And Stuart in Sheffield, has been in touch, he says, in the Socialist Republic of South Yorkshire. He says, can you ask Liam what an IMF bailout means for the general population? How would it actually affect us day to day?
So what it would mean, and it may not even be the IMF. The IMF may not be big enough. There may have to be some kind of, even more international effort made if this happens. What it would mean is that, interest rates, no one cares what the Bank of England's saying anymore. That's just mood music. Market interest rates have gone completely in the opposite direction, upward. And they have been doing that for well over a year, as some of us have been saying endlessly. It would mean that borrowing costs spike even more across the economy. That would push up inflation. That would then push up borrowing costs for government further. The pound, unfortunately, because no pleasure to say this, would come under pressure. And the government may face genuine difficulties making its payments. That's where we are. That's why people like Professor Jajit Chadha have said what they've said. And the Telegraph, I think, when I gave them the full transcript to the interview with Jajit, Chatter. People can also watch the full interview on my Substack when the facts change. But the Telegraph did a good job. They didn't just take Chatter's word for it, that they realised his importance. That's why they were then pursued the reporting of it. They got two other former members of the Monetary Policy Committee, Andrew Sentance and Willem Buiter. Again, not card-carrying Tories by any means. Buiter is a man of the left, but saying exactly the same thing, that this is a major problem. And Peter, you and I, we know a lot of the same people in politics. I didn't work at the top of government the way you did, though you know the people I know. I've tried really hard to warn, friends and colleagues in government now, to warn friends and colleagues in the other political parties that this is where we are.
Yeah.
And it is where we are. So let's not have ridiculous conversations about whether or not Rachel Reeves has missed her headroom by 9 or 5 billion in 2029, Peter, because in the last fiscal year, the OBR said we'd borrow 80 billion, right? And we borrowed 150 billion. So the forecast was 70 billion out.
Yeah.
1 year. So let's not have conversations about whether it's 5 billion out in 5 years. It's a completely facile debate.
Just before we get to the news, Liam, I just want to ask you about Trump's hundreds of products having tariffs on them, up to 25%, shampoo to washing machines and so on. What effect do you think this will have?
Well, look, you're doing exactly what we can't do, Peter. You're looking, well, maybe I'm being unfair. We can't blame this on someone else.
I'm not blaming it on anybody. I'm just asking your opinion on what would happen.
We politically don't like. We have to look to ourselves. We have to look.
So what can we do? How can we get out of this?
The state needs to be smaller. The state is out of control. We've got 25% of people now who rely on the state directly for their living. We've got tens of thousands more civil servants, accelerating all the time than we had before COVID. We've got a political and media class, particularly a government front bench, that seems to have no grasp of anything to do with finance. There's no one in Downing Street the way there was under Blair and Brown. There were excellent people in Downing Street under Blair and Brown, many of whom I knew and respect to this day, some of whom have passed, people who really understood financial markets and were in the room when decisions were made. There's no one like that in Downing Street now, because I'm afraid, Peter, they've been ideologically excluded.
Very, very interesting. A real warning there, Liam. Thank you for that. Liam Halligan, economist and author of the Substack When the Facts Change. And you can watch that interview on his Substack, as he says there.